All right, continuing our discussion of fiscal policy. Before I move on, I want to go back and elaborate on something I mentioned in the last lecture, this idea of a progressive tax system, tax progressivity. A progressive tax system is one in which taxes rise with GDP. In other words, as you make more money, or as the country as a whole makes more money, GDP goes up. That also means income goes up because GDP and income are the same thing, circular flow model. Then the government will get more and more money. It gets a large, you may pay 10% on your first 50,000 and 20% on your second 50,000, just as an example. That may not seem fair to rich people, but it is fair. But more importantly, it's progressive, and therefore it sucks money out as income goes up, preventing the economy from overheating. And as income falls, it sucks less money out, putting a floor under GDP and income. That's a progressive tax system. And one of its greatest features is that it has this sort of automatic stabilizing effect. A proportional tax system is one in which the tax rate remains constant with GDP. This is a popular idea with some people. They say, well, we should just have a flat 10% tax for everyone. The problem with that is, regardless of what you think about its fairness, is that it would not have an automatic stabilizing effect. Income would rise, and the government's income would rise proportionally, but not at a faster rate. It would not cool an overheated economy, nor would it put a floor under a falling economy. The third kind of tax system is a regressive tax system, one in which the tax rate falls as GDP rises. The more money you make, the less you pay. The less money you make, the more you pay. That seems patently unfair, but in fact, Alabama more or less has a regressive tax system. We rely so heavily, our income taxes are low and fairly proportional, and our property taxes are low. We raise most of our money from sales taxes, which disproportionately fall upon the poor people. What's bad about this is it exacerbates, it makes recessions worse and booms even boomier. So it doesn't make good economic sense from a stabilizing effect either. All right, we're going to look at the fiscal policy history of the last 20 years of the federal government. And I could throw out these huge numbers, trillions, billions, and they wouldn't make much sense. So what we're going to do is look at either the deficit or the surplus. The deficit, of course, is if the government spends more money than it takes in. Surplus if it spends less money than it takes in. If it's a negative sign, it's a deficit. It's a plus sign, it's a surplus. We're going to look at that actual number, whatever it was, 200 billion, 100 billion, as a percentage of GDP. Because if we say that our deficit's $1 trillion and Greece's is only 50 billion, well, they look a lot better, but no, it's much worse because their economy is so much vastly tinier than ours. So we're going to look at it as a percentage of GDP. Now, we start off in the early 90s, 1990 through, let's say, 92, and wow, we see some big deficits, up to 4.6% of GDP. We were in a recession, quite frankly. And what do you do in a recession? Well, you engage in expansionary policy to help get us out of it. That leads to deficits. The deficits were projected to continue after recovery, so taxes were raised. President George H.W. Bush very famously said, read my lips, no new taxes, and then in part he lost the 92 election because he raised taxes. But I think he was a hero for doing that because he saw it was the prudent financial thing to do. Continuing with that, the Clinton administration worked in a compromised fashion with Republicans in Congress to create balanced budgets, and eventually surpluses started coming out. You'll see in 98, 99, 2000, and 2001, the U.S. government made more money than it spent. It was very fiscally responsible. Well, what would it do with a surplus? Well, it'll pay off old debt. When President George W. Bush came in, he advocated lowering taxes in the early 2000s because he said, look, we've got surpluses. That's your money. We should cut taxes if we're making more money than we're spending. And that made a lot of sense. And actually it worked out, turned out to be good timing because there was a a mild recession in 2001, and that cutting of taxes was sort of an expansionary fiscal policy that kind of helped ease the burden of that. Something else also happened in 2001, you'll recall, 9/11. And we launched a very costly war in 2003, our second costly war, and yet we continued to cut taxes. We also launched a very expensive drug benefit for Medicare, for the seniors, and so our deficits began to get really high. Even so, our economy was strong, and after peaking in 2004, they started going back down. Then, of course, in 2008, 2009, we have the worst recession in U.S. history since the Great Depression. The federal government had to engage in expensive, expansionary fiscal policy, a stimulus, something called TARP. They cut taxes further. They preserved the Bush-era tax cuts and cut taxes further to give people money to spend. The result was a negative 10.1 budget deficit in 2009. It's now under 9 for 2010, probably be about that for 2011, but we're talking trillion-dollar deficits. We already had deficits. We had a severe recession, so we're in a rather difficult situation. Now, fiscal policy, this adjustment of taxes and spending to manipulate the economy, has some problems. First of all, it has some timing problems. There's what we call the recognition lag. It takes months to realize that we're in a recession or that inflation is actually occurring. So first you got to recognize the problem, and that takes months. Secondly, there's administrative lag. Fiscal policy happens in Congress. Congress relies on a democratic process. It moves slowly. It's complicated. There was a small stimulus package voted on following the 9/11 attacks. Everybody agreed it was the right thing to do. It still took 5 months to happen. And thirdly, there's an operational lag. Actually making this happen takes time. The fiscal action takes time to affect actual output. For example, you say we're going to spend $100 billion to build roads. Well, you've got to hire designers. You've got to hire contractors. This takes potentially years. In addition to the timing problems, there are political problems with fiscal policy. As I said, it's conducted in the political arena, which creates the possibility of political considerations swamping economic considerations. Congress may pass tax cuts just to get reelected, or stimulus spending to please special interests. You've probably heard of the bridge to nowhere. I might not need a bridge in the middle of nowhere, Alaska, but I'm going to vote for it because people will like it and return me to Congress. Also, future policy reversals. There are sometimes unintended consequences. If you cut people's taxes to give them money to go spend to boost consumption, they may think, yeah, but you're going to have to raise my taxes later, so I'm just going to save this money. And you've sort of undone yourself. Another problem is offsetting state and local fiscal policy. The federal government can borrow money ad infinitum, so it's stimulating the economy. But what's happening with state and local governments? Well, their income is going down too, and they can't run a giant deficit. They have to balance their budgets. So they start firing teachers, firing policemen, and so they're spending less even as the federal government is spending more, so it sort of blunts the stimulative effect of the federal government. And then finally, the crowding out effect. The government has to borrow all of this money, hundreds of billions, trillions of dollars, and theoretically over time, it's going to crowd out. It's the big gorilla. It's going to crowd out the private investors who want to borrow money to build maybe a factory. It's not a problem right now, but it is a potential problem.